Christa Pike's attorneys say she takes full responsibility for the killing. They say she is asking for her sentence to be commuted to life in prison.
The night before the murder, nobody at the Job Corps Center in Knoxville thought history was quietly forming inside those dormitory walls. Not the counselors, not the students, not the girl who would soon die, and certainly not the 18-year-old woman who would later become one of the most infamous female killers in modern American history. Her name was Christa Pike. Today, she sits alone on Tennessee's death row, the only woman there. And according to the Tennessee Supreme Court, the state plans to execute her on September 30th, 2026. If that happens, she will become the first woman executed in Tennessee in more than 200 years. But long before the headlines, before the pentagram carved into human flesh, before the photographs, the courtroom, and the death sentence, there was just a broken teenager trying to survive a childhood that already looked like hell. Christa Pike was born in West Virginia in 1976. From the beginning, chaos surrounded her life. According to later court records and psychiatric evaluations, her childhood was filled with violence, abuse, neglect, alcohol, and instability. Her lawyers would eventually argue that she suffered severe trauma from an early age, including repeated physical and sexual abuse. But trauma does not announce itself loudly at first. Sometimes it grows slowly, quietly, like rot spreading inside wood. Teachers described her as troubled, angry, detached, sometimes explosive, sometimes withdrawn. People who knew her later said she could switch personalities within seconds, laughing one moment and cold the next. By the age of 18, she was already drifting through life with almost no real support system. That was when she arrived at the Job Corps Center in Knoxville, Tennessee. For many students, Job Corps was supposed to be a second chance, a place where young adults could learn trades, escape poverty, and rebuild their future. But inside those dorms, emotions burned fast. Relationships formed overnight. Jealousy spread even faster. And somewhere inside that pressure cooker, Christa Pike met a 17-year-old boy named Tatterall Shipp. The relationship became obsessive almost immediately. The two reportedly bonded over violent fantasies, dark symbolism, and emotional instability. Students later described the pair as intense, unpredictable, and frightening together. Then another name entered the story. Colleen Slemmer, 19 years old, quiet, small, vulnerable. According to prosecutors, Pike became convinced Colleen was trying to steal Tatterall away from her. Whether that belief was real or imagined almost stopped mattering. Because once obsession takes control, logic usually dies first. In January of 1995, the tension exploded. But what happened next would shock even veteran homicide investigators. This was not a sudden shooting, not a drunken accident, not a crime committed in panic. Police would later describe it as torture, a slow and deliberate attack carried out deep in the woods near the University of Tennessee Agricultural Campus. And according to testimony, it lasted close to 30 minutes. That detail haunted investigators for years. 30 minutes. That is enough time to stop. Enough time to walk away. Enough time to realize someone is begging for their life. But prosecutors said the violence only escalated. On the night of January 12th, Pike, Shipp, and another friend named Shadala Peterson lured Colleen into the woods. At first, nothing seemed unusual. 3 students walking together through the darkness. But once they reached the isolated area, the atmosphere changed. The attack began suddenly. Investigators later said Colleen was beaten, slashed, tortured, and psychologically terrorized while pleading for mercy. One of the most disturbing allegations came from the pentagram carved into her chest, a detail that instantly transformed the case into national news and fueled media obsession with satanic imagery during the 1990s. But the horror did not stop there. According to court testimony, Pike used a chunk of asphalt to crush Colleen's skull. Then came the detail that made hardened detectives sick. After the murder, prosecutors said Pike kept a piece of the victim's skull as a souvenir. Not hidden away in fear, not discarded in panic, kept, as if the murder itself was not enough. When police began investigating, witnesses quickly pointed toward Pike and the others. The evidence mounted fast. Statements, physical evidence, testimony from students inside Job Corps. And before long, the teenager who once arrived in Knoxville looking for a second chance was now facing something almost unimaginable: the death penalty. But what truly shocked America was not just the brutality of the crime. It was her age. Christa Pike was only 18 years old, young enough for some people to still see a child, old enough for Tennessee prosecutors to seek death. And in court, the state would paint her not as damaged, not as mentally broken, but as evil itself. The trial was about to begin, and once the jury heard the full story, there would be no turning back. By the time Christa Pike entered the courtroom, the entire state of Tennessee already knew her name. Newspapers called her a monster. Television stations replayed the details every night. An 18-year-old girl accused of torturing her classmate, carving a pentagram into her chest, and keeping part of her skull as a trophy. It sounded less like reality, and more like a horror film. But for Colleen Slemmer's family, none of it was fiction. Their daughter was dead, and now they had to sit in a courtroom and hear exactly how she died. The trial began in 1996. From the start, prosecutors made one thing clear. This was not a crime of passion, not self-defense, not an accident. They argued the murder was calculated, sadistic, and carried out for pleasure. And the deeper the jury looked into Christa Pike's behavior after the killing, the darker the case became. Witnesses from Job Corps testified that Pike bragged about the murder afterward. Some said she laughed. Others claimed she described the attack in disturbing detail without showing remorse. One witness testified that Pike showed people a small piece of skull she allegedly carried around after the killing. That testimony stunned the courtroom into silence. Even in murder trials, there are moments that feel too dark to fully process. This was one of them. Then prosecutors revealed photographs from the crime scene. Jurors reportedly struggled to look at them. The injuries were extensive. The violence was personal. Nothing about the attack suggested hesitation. According to medical testimony, Colleen Slemmer suffered repeated blunt force trauma before dying. Prosecutors argued she remained conscious for part of the assault, meaning she understood what was happening as the attack continued. That detail changed everything emotionally inside the courtroom, because suffering matters in death penalty cases, and prosecutors knew it. The state's argument was simple. The murder was exceptionally cruel, cruel enough to justify execution. Meanwhile, Christa Pike's defense team faced an almost impossible challenge. How do you defend someone the public already sees as beyond saving? They did not deny Pike participated in the murder. Instead, they focused on her psychological state, her childhood, her trauma, her mental instability. Defense attorneys brought forward evidence describing years of abuse, neglect, and emotional damage. Experts testified that Pike's upbringing was filled with violence and dysfunction severe enough to distort her emotional development. But there was a problem. Trauma can explain behavior. It does not always excuse it. And inside that courtroom, the brutality of the murder overshadowed almost everything else. Then came the prosecution's most devastating strategy. They focused not only on what Pike did, but on who she appeared to become afterward. Cold, detached, unapologetic, at times even amused. Jurors later said her demeanor disturbed them almost as much as the evidence itself. Because in many death penalty trials, emotion matters. Fear matters. Humanity matters. And prosecutors successfully convinced the jury that Christa Pike had almost none left. Still, one figure inside the courtroom drew nearly as much attention as Pike herself. Tatterell Shipp, the boyfriend, the accomplice, the young man prosecutors claimed helped carry out the torture and murder. But unlike Pike, Shipp would not receive a death sentence. That difference would later spark years of controversy. Why did one receive death while the other did not? Was Pike truly more responsible? Or did the jury react differently because she was a woman accused of unimaginable violence? Even decades later, critics still debate that question. Because society often struggles to process female brutality. Male killers become expected. Female killers become unforgettable. And Christa Pike became unforgettable very quickly. During closing arguments, prosecutors delivered the line that would define the case. They described Pike as evil. Not sick, not damaged. Evil. The word hung over the courtroom like smoke. And when jurors entered deliberation, most observers already sensed the outcome. It did not take long. The jury found Christa Pike guilty of first-degree murder. Then came the sentencing phase. Life in prison, or death. For Pike's attorneys, this was the final chance to save her life. They begged jurors to consider her age. 18 years old, barely an adult, still emotionally immature, still shaped by horrific abuse, still capable, they argued, of rehabilitation. But prosecutors returned again to the details of the murder. The torture, the carving, the skull fragment, the lack of remorse. And ultimately, those details proved stronger than the defense's pleas. The jury sentenced Christa Pike to death. At just 18 years old, she became the youngest woman sentenced to death in the United States during the modern era of capital punishment. APnews.com. Inside the courtroom, Colleen Slemmer's family cried quietly. For them, nothing would bring their daughter back. But across America, reactions were divided. Some people believed the sentence was fully justified. Others saw something more disturbing. A deeply damaged teenager condemned to die before she was even old enough to legally buy alcohol. And over the next 3 decades, the debate would only grow louder. Because death row changes people. Time changes people. And the woman Tennessee planned to execute in 2026 would not remain the same 18-year-old girl forever. But before the execution date, before the appeals, before the interviews and national headlines, Christa Pike would spend years inside one of the darkest places in America, Tennessee's death row. And behind those prison walls, things would somehow become even more disturbing. When the courtroom doors finally closed behind Christa Pike, the noise of the trial disappeared almost instantly. No cameras, no reporters, no jurors staring at her face. Only steel doors, concrete walls, and the long silence of death row. For most inmates, prison is measured in years. For death row prisoners, life is measured differently. In appeals, in execution warrants, in birthdays they may never see again. And Christa Pike entered that world before she was even 20 years old. At the Tennessee Prison for Women, Pike quickly became one of the most infamous inmates in the entire system. Not only because of the murder, but because she was the only woman on Tennessee's death row, alone in a category of her own. That kind of isolation changes people. Some prisoners become religious. Some disappear into routine. Others slowly break apart mentally. But according to prison reports and later interviews, Pike remained volatile for years. And prison officials soon realized the violence from the woods in Knoxville had not completely disappeared. In 1996, only months after arriving on death row, Pike became involved in another shocking incident. Authorities said she attempted to kill another inmate using a shoelace. The alleged target was Patricia Jones, a fellow prisoner Pike reportedly believed was trying to steal her boyfriend. The motive sounded horrifyingly familiar. Jealousy, obsession, possession. The same emotional spiral prosecutors said led to Colleen Slemmer's murder. According to reports, Pike and another inmate attacked Jones inside prison, wrapping a cord around her neck and nearly killing her before guards intervened. UPI.com. For many observers, that moment destroyed any remaining argument that Pike's violence existed only in her teenage years. This was after the trial, after the death sentence, after seeing what murder had done to her life. And yet prosecutors argued she was still dangerous, still capable of extreme violence. The state eventually charged Pike with attempted first-degree murder for the prison attack. Years later, she pleaded guilty. That plea would quietly follow her through every future appeal, because death penalty cases often revolve around one central question. Can this person ever safely exist in society again? For Pike, The prison attack became powerful evidence against her. Still, time continued moving. Slowly, brutally slowly. The years passed. 1997, 2000, 2005, 2010. Outside prison walls, America changed completely. Phones became smartphones. The internet transformed daily life. Entire generations grew up. But inside death row, routines barely changed at all. Wake up. Count time. Metal trays through a slot in the door. Limited recreation. Constant surveillance. And always the possibility that one day the state could schedule your death. Some former guards later described Pike as intelligent and manipulative. Others said she could appear calm for long periods before suddenly becoming explosive. Over time, she also began giving interviews from prison. And those interviews only deepened public fascination with her case. Because unlike many inmates who express clear remorse decades later, Pike's statements sometimes sounded detached, even contradictory. At times, she accepted responsibility. At other moments, she minimized parts of the crime or blamed emotional instability and drug use. For the families involved, those interviews reopened wounds again and again, especially for Colleen Slemmer's relatives. While Pike continued speaking to media outlets from prison, Colleen remained forever 19 years old. That contrast haunted the case. But another reality slowly emerged over the decades. Christa Pike was no longer the teenage girl from 1995. She was aging inside a concrete cell, wrinkles replacing youth, time replacing rage. And as execution debates returned to national headlines, a difficult question slowly formed around her case. Should a person be executed for who they were at 18, or for who they become after 30 years behind bars? Tennessee would soon have to answer that question, because after decades of appeals and delays, the state finally set an execution date, September 30th, 2026, and suddenly, the clock on death row no longer felt endless. For decades, Christa Pike lived in a strange psychological limbo, condemned to die, but never knowing when. That uncertainty becomes its own kind of punishment on death row. Inmates learn to survive by believing tomorrow will probably arrive. Appeals drag on for years, sometimes decades. Execution dates appear, then disappear again. Many prisoners die of old age before the state ever reaches them. But in Christa Pike's case, the waiting finally changed. In 2025, Tennessee officially scheduled her execution for September 30th, 2026. The announcement instantly pushed her case back into national headlines. CNN.com. Because this was no ordinary execution story anymore. If Tennessee carries it out, Pike will become the first woman executed by the state in more than 2 centuries. That fact alone transformed the case into something larger than one murder trial. Now the debate reached beyond Christa Pike herself. It became a national argument about capital punishment, trauma, mental illness, gender, and whether society truly believes people can change. Supporters of the execution say the answer is simple. They point back to January of 1995, to Colleen Slemmer, to the torture, to the suffering, to the skull fragment allegedly kept as a souvenir. For them, the brutality of the crime outweighs everything else. No amount of time changes what happened in those woods, and no amount of aging erases responsibility. Some prosecutors and victims advocates argue that Pike's later prison violence only reinforced the original sentence. They say the attempted prison murder proved the danger never disappeared. But opponents of the execution see something very different. They see an abused 18-year-old girl shaped by catastrophic childhood trauma long before she ever committed murder. Mental health experts supporting Pike's appeals have argued that her upbringing involved severe physical abuse, sexual abuse, drug exposure, and neglect so extreme it fundamentally damaged her emotional development. TheGuardian.com. And over the years, another argument gained momentum. Age. Not her current age. Her age at the time of the crime. 18. Legally an adult, yes. But neurologically? Modern neuroscience increasingly suggests the human brain, especially areas controlling impulse, judgment, and emotional regulation, continues developing well into the 20s. Critics of Pike's sentence argue that distinction matters deeply in death penalty cases. Because if society recognizes teenagers are psychologically unfinished, should the state still execute someone for actions committed barely beyond childhood? The debate intensified even further because Pike's accomplice, Tatterall Shipp, did not receive a death sentence. That difference still troubles many legal observers today. Both participated in the murder. Both were present in the woods. Yet only one ended up facing execution. Pike's attorneys have repeatedly argued that gender stereotypes may have influenced the outcome. According to that argument, jurors reacted more strongly because society viewed her violence as unnatural for a woman. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the public remains fascinated by her. Not just angry, fascinated. True crime documentaries continue revisiting the case. Social media debates explode whenever new legal filings appear. Some people see Pike as pure evil. Others see her as a tragic product of abuse and untreated mental illness. Very few see her simply as human. Meanwhile, inside prison walls, Pike continues waiting. Waiting through appeals. Waiting through legal motions. Waiting through endless discussions about whether she deserves to live. And somewhere beyond all the headlines sits another family entirely. The Slemmer family. For them, this debate never became philosophical. Their daughter never received decades to reflect, mature, or change. Her life ended in the freezing woods of Knoxville at 19 years old. That reality remains the emotional center of the case, no matter how many arguments surround it. Now, as the execution date approaches, Tennessee moves closer to a decision that could place the state into national history again. Not because of how Christa Pike lived, but because of how the state may choose to end her life. And in the final months before a scheduled execution, everything changes. The prison routine changes. The legal pressure changes. Even time itself begins to feel different. Because once an execution date becomes real, every sunrise starts looking like it might be one of the last. As the execution date moved closer, Christa Pike's case transformed into a legal battlefield once again. After more than 30 years on death row, her attorneys were no longer trying to prove she was innocent. That fight ended decades earlier. Now the question was different. Should Tennessee still kill her? Every appeal filed by Pike's defense centered around that single issue. Not the murder itself, but whether execution, after so many years, still served justice. Her lawyers argued that the woman sitting on death row in 2026 was not the same person who entered prison in 1996. Back then, she was an unstable 18-year-old shaped by violence, addiction, and trauma. Now she was approaching 50, older, physically weaker, removed from society for more than half her life. Defense teams in long-term death row cases often rely on one powerful idea. Human beings can change. And Pike's attorneys attempted to show exactly that. They pointed to decades spent in prison, educational efforts, religious reflection, psychological evaluations. Even small details mattered. How inmates interacted with guards, how often disciplinary reports appeared, whether they expressed remorse. But prosecutors responded with a brutal counterargument. Some crimes, they said, permanently crossed the line beyond redemption. And the murder of Colleen Slemmer belonged in that category. The state continued emphasizing the torture involved in the attack, the suffering, the mutilation, the psychological cruelty. Prosecutors argued that Pike's later prison violence proved rehabilitation had never truly occurred. For them, this was not simply about punishment. It was about accountability. The state also rejected claims that Pike's age should spare her execution. Legally, she was 18 at the time of the murder, an adult under Tennessee law. And prosecutors feared a dangerous precedent. If 18 becomes too young for execution, where does the line stop? 19? 20? 21? The courts wrestled with those questions repeatedly as new appeals arrived. Meanwhile, outside the legal system, public opinion remained sharply divided. Victims' rights groups strongly supported the execution. Many argued that endless appeals only prolonged pain for Colleen Slemmer's family. Some believed Pike had already received more mercy than her victim ever did. But anti-death penalty organizations viewed the case differently. For them, Christa Pike represented almost every failure inside the American justice system at once. Child abuse, mental illness, teenage instability, prison violence, and a punishment many countries around the world no longer use. Several advocacy groups pointed out that the United States remains one of the few Western nations still carrying out executions. And even within America, executions have steadily declined over recent decades. DeathPenaltyInfo.org. That broader cultural shift placed even more attention on Tennessee's decision. Because executions today no longer feel routine. Each one becomes national news. Each one reignites moral debate. And Christa Pike's gender made the case even more unusual. Female executions remain extraordinarily rare in the United States. Historically, juries are often less willing to sentence women to death. In many cases, women receive life sentences even for extremely violent crimes. But Pike's case broke through that barrier completely. To prosecutors, the brutality was simply too severe. As legal motions continued, another uncomfortable reality emerged. Time had changed the public's perception of the crime itself. Younger generations discovering the case online sometimes reacted differently than jurors did in the 1990s. Back then, America was deep inside the era of satanic panic, when media stories involving pentagrams, occult imagery, and ritualistic violence triggered enormous fear. Today, some legal analysts argue that atmosphere may have intensified Pike's original sentencing. Others reject that idea completely, insisting the facts alone justified death regardless of cultural climate. But no matter where people stood, one truth became impossible to ignore. The closer the execution date came, the more real death became for everyone involved. For prison officials preparing procedures, for attorneys filing final appeals, for activists protesting outside courthouses, for Colleen Slemmer's family reliving the horror yet again, and especially for Christa Pike herself, because after decades of uncertainty, the abstract idea of execution was beginning to transform into something terrifyingly concrete. A room, a gurney, witnesses, last words, and a final walk that cannot be reversed. There is something deeply unsettling about speaking to someone who knows the state may soon kill them. Not next year, not someday, soon. That reality changes the atmosphere around every conversation, every interview, every ordinary moment inside prison walls. And as September 30th, 2026 approaches, Christa Pike lives under that shadow every single day. By now, she has spent more than 30 years incarcerated, more than half her life. Entire worlds have risen and disappeared outside her prison cell. Presidents changed. Wars began and ended. Technology transformed humanity. Children born the year she was sentenced are now adults themselves. But inside Tennessee's death row system, time moves differently. Slowly, mechanically, almost unnaturally. Former death row inmates often describe a strange psychological effect after decades in isolation. Life becomes smaller. The outside world starts feeling imaginary. Even freedom can begin to feel frightening because prison routine eventually replaces normal existence. For Christa Pike, that isolation became even more extreme because she remained the only woman on Tennessee's death row for years. No real peers. No shared female death row population around her. Just separation and waiting. In recent interviews and legal filings, Pike has sometimes appeared calmer than the volatile teenager prosecutors described during trial. Age has visibly changed her. The rage-filled 18-year-old from courtroom photographs no longer exists physically, but the crime still does. That is the central tension surrounding her case. Can a human being outgrow something horrific enough to deserve death forever? Or are certain acts simply permanent? Families of murder victims often say the passage of time changes nothing. And for Colleen Slemmer's relatives, the wound never truly closed. Every news article about Christa Pike reopens it. Every interview, every appeal, every delayed execution date. While Pike continues living inside prison walls, Colleen's life remains frozen at 19 forever. That imbalance fuels much of the anger surrounding the case. Still, death row itself creates difficult moral questions, even for people who support capital punishment. What does 30 years waiting for execution actually do to a human mind? Some legal experts argue that decades of isolation and uncertainty become a second punishment layered on top of the sentence itself. In many countries, holding prisoners under execution conditions for extremely long periods would violate human rights laws. But the American legal system has historically allowed those delays because appeals are meant to prevent wrongful executions. That contradiction creates a strange reality. The more carefully courts review death sentences, the longer inmates remain waiting to die. And waiting can become its own form of psychological destruction. Some former prison staff have described death row inmates developing severe anxiety, paranoia, depression, and emotional detachment over time. Others become deeply religious. Some completely withdraw from human interaction. A few eventually stop fighting their execution altogether. But according to recent filings, Pike continues pursuing appeals aggressively. Her attorneys are expected to challenge multiple aspects of the case before the scheduled execution date arrives. Mental health arguments, sentencing fairness, constitutional questions, and prison conditions may all become part of the final legal battle. Tennessean.com. Meanwhile, public fascination with her story keeps growing online, partly because female killers remain rare, partly because the crime itself was so disturbing, but also because people are drawn toward moral conflict. And Christa Pike's story is built entirely on moral conflict. Was she born violent or created by abuse? Does trauma reduce responsibility? Can someone be both victim and monster at the same time? Those questions have no easy answers. That may be why the case continues haunting people decades later. And now, as the execution date moves closer, another reality becomes unavoidable. One day soon, unless courts intervene, Tennessee prison officials may ask Christa Pike a final series of questions. What will your last meal be? Who should witness your execution? Do you want to say any final words? For most people, those questions sound unreal, like scenes from a movie. But for inmates nearing execution, they become terrifyingly practical. Because eventually, after years of appeals and arguments, every death row case reaches the same moment. The moment where theory disappears, and death becomes procedure. Somewhere inside Tennessee's prison system, there's already a protocol prepared for Christa Pike's death. A checklist, a timeline, a sequence of procedures practiced long before the execution chamber is ever used. That is one of the coldest realities of capital punishment. Death becomes administrative, measured in signatures, schedules, and chemicals. And unless courts intervene, the state plans to carry out Christa Pike's execution on September 30th, 2026. If it happens, history will remember the moment for several reasons at once. The first woman executed in Tennessee in more than 200 years. One of the youngest female death row inmates in modern American history. And the final chapter of a murder case that has haunted the state since 1995. But even now, after decades of headlines, arguments, and documentaries, the same uncomfortable question still remains. What exactly should society do with someone like Christa Pike? For some people, the answer has always been obvious. Execute her. The brutality of Colleen Slemmer's murder crossed every moral boundary imaginable. Torture, psychological terror, mutilation, the kind of violence that permanently scars everyone connected to it. To supporters of the sentence, mercy toward Pike feels like betrayal toward the victim. And for many families affected by violent crime, closure matters deeply. They believe justice loses meaning if punishment never arrives. But others see the case differently. Not because they excuse the murder, not because they deny the horror, but because they question whether execution itself solves anything anymore. After all, what does killing a nearly 50-year-old woman truly accomplish 30 years after the crime? Does it heal grief? Does it prevent future violence? Or does it simply continue a cycle of death that began in those woods back in 1995? That debate sits at the center of modern America's struggle with the death penalty. And Christa Pike's case forces people into emotional territory most would rather avoid, because she does not fit neatly into a single category. She was abused, but she also became abusive. She was deeply damaged, but she also inflicted catastrophic damage onto someone else. She was once an unstable teenager, but she later committed violence even inside prison. Every argument surrounding her case contains truth mixed with contradiction, and perhaps that is why people remain obsessed with it. Not because it is simple, but because it refuses to be simple. Meanwhile, one truth remains unchanged through every appeal, every documentary, and every media debate. Colleen Slemmer never came home. While the world argues over Christa Pike's fate, Colleen's family has spent decades living with an absence that never heals completely. Birthdays passed without her. Holidays, family gatherings, entire futures erased before they could begin. That loss exists at the center of this story, whether people support execution or oppose it. And maybe that is the darkest part of all. No ending can truly feel satisfying here. Not execution, not life imprisonment, not forgiveness, not revenge, because some crimes leave damage too permanent for any legal system to fully resolve. Now, as Tennessee moves closer toward the scheduled execution date, Christa Pike continues waking up each morning inside a prison cell, knowing the state may soon decide exactly when her final day begins. One final breakfast, one final walk, one final set of witnesses watching through glass. And somewhere beyond those prison walls, America will once again divide into two familiar sides. Those who believe justice is being carried out, and those who believe another death will solve nothing. But when the lights finally dim inside the execution chamber, when the paperwork is signed, when the clock reaches the final minute, the real question may not be what kind of person Christa Pike became. The real question may be what kind of society chooses to answer death with another death.